get it going.
According to Christian Romans and Greek gods were considered demons because they were pagan gods. Um, and the way that the Greeks actually looked at them is that you had two different series of godlike figures. You had your actual gods, and you had your, I always mispronounce this, but it's like the diamonds, which were like the way that we may have learned about them were more like demigods. They were physically on Earth, and they were the ones that kind of were like the messengers or the do-goers or whatever of the actual gods, because none of us have actually seen the gods. So they were kind of like that between the human and God type relationship. Um, and they considered these to be like the intermediates, but they were also considered to be the ones that were capable of magic and like astrological activities. Like they were, I guess you could almost look at them as like the witches in different, religions or paganism or, sections of the worlds. They had that kind of ability. And in that case, they often shared their beliefs with the human race. And the diamonds, they were also gods, but they also could have been either lost heroes or considered the dead. They didn't have to actually be a living soul. It could have been a dead person per se. One of the examples of their powers that they had were the ability to freeze a lake over completely in an instant in order to help you cross it. So in Greek and Roman history, they weren't necessarily evil. They were, in a sense, either they did neutral activities or they did, things that were kind of helpful, which I kind of thought it was interesting that they used that example because we also use the term hell freezes over quite frequently. So I wonder if there was a little correlation there. And they also believed that you could summon your own diamond because we all had one inside of us, just like, in some beliefs, we all have demons or a demon per se that lives inside of us. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And through the diamonds that were right in front of you, they taught you how to conjure them through magic.
One of the first things you're talking about the daemon or the demon or whatever, honestly, you'll see it spelled differently based on your translation. You'll see the AI sometimes, and you'll see the AE other times, and the AE is just pronounced E most of the time. So as you're talking about it, it appears very prominently in the writings of Marcus Aurelius, the famous philosopher emperor. And you may remember him as the emperor in Gladiator. At the beginning, he was the original Dumbledore actor. And Marcus Aurelius says that one of the keys to finding balance and fulfillment in your life is that you have to balance your own soul with your demon. And it's something that he talks about pretty frequently. It's kind of like almost a yin and yang kind of thing if you want to go into Taoism, if you want to go down that path. So it's basically like your familiar spirit. And as you said, you can conjure it and you can make it do shit for you, depending on, as the case is. But very often the will of that demon and your will don't line up, and this causes various issues. It's a familiar concept in a lot of religions where, you have good and evil tendencies raging inside of you. Like that brand new album, the God and Devil are raging inside of me or something like that. And one of the points of your life in those kind of systems is to balance those good and evil tendencies, to balance the will of God and your own will. And that's how you are happy, basically. Now, as far as the stuff you're saying about the Jews and their beliefs, throughout the ancient world, it was very much a customary thing that if I go into battle, if I am like Babylonian or whatever, I go into battle under the sign of my God. whether that's Marduk or whether that's someone else. We go into battle against the Greeks, and they're fighting under the sign of Zeus. They kick our ass. I'm not going to worship Marduk anymore because he's a loser. I'm going to worship Zeus now. I'm going to worship the gods of the people that beat me. Now, the part that gets interesting is something that you had mentioned before. You have all of these conquered gods that are out there, but people don't just come out and say, "Oh, those aren't real." They have to have some other purpose. You know, we worship them this whole time. We're not just going to come in and say, "Oh, we made them up." So very often they're seen as being of questionable character. They're seen as being primitive or even being evil. Like new gods replace the old gods all the time throughout history. And there are many scholars of the Old Testament that look at the stories where the Israelites throughout the Old Testament are supposed to worship God. They're supposed to worship Jewish God. That is the whole theme of the Old Testament. But they don't. And seemingly every 2 or 3 pages, they're worshiping a different God. And then Jewish God gets mad at them and he sends a prophet or sends something to correct them, to turn them back on the right path. And it's a belief among some scholars that the Jews were never really monotheistic, that they always thought characters such as Baal, who you talk about all the time. You know, if you're in a religion class with younger kids, you have to say Baal, because if you say they worshipped Baal, you know, they all start laughing. Ha ha, it's funny. Especially the part in the Bible when it says, quote, they worshipped the Baals, because there are many passages that say that. Because Baal is just a Canaanite word that means Lord. And so there are many different Baals in that pantheon. You can't say that when you're teaching kids. So that's why sometimes you hear it pronounced Baal or Baal, as some people try to drag it out. So anyway, there's Baal, there's Asherah, who's a fertility goddess, sometimes called Ishtar. One of her signs is an owl. So like when you see girls with those owl earrings, it's actually one of the insignias of this fertility goddess, who is later associated with Lilith, but I didn't get to Lilith, you know, that's a whole other thing. So anyway, they have all these other gods, and they all serve different purposes. Baal is known as a rain god. That is his basic purpose. He is the rider on the storm clouds, and they pray to him when they want rain for the crops. Because when you live in a desert, you're kind of dependent on the annual flood, or else you're pretty much shit out of luck. You know, you can't really do anything. So they would pray to him when they wanted rain, when they wanted something like that. At childbirth, they would pray to an Asherah or an Astarte or any of those others. There's a bunch of them that are named. And then there are some other more sinister gods that are mentioned in the Old Testament, including the Canaanite god Moloch or Molech or Moloch, depending on your translation. And he appears in the form of a giant bull. And what Moloch is interested in is child sacrifice. He likes the taste of children, I guess. I don't know. So you don't just like butcher your kids, you burn them. And this is how you offer a sacrifice to Moloch. You literally like take your kids and throw them in a fire, as like the priest of Moloch does whatever kind of ritual. And this is something that's strictly forbidden by Jewish God, obviously. And if you ever hear the term immolate or immolation, it means that you're sending someone to Moloch, which means that you are burning them alive. Now that's where you get the term immolation, if you're curious. So there's all of these other different characters. And what's very interesting is that when you actually look at the 10 Commandments, God says in the first commandment, I alone am God. You shall not worship any of these other gods. He doesn't say, I am the only God. He just says, you only worship me. And that's very interesting. And scholars have postulated that the Jews believed in all these other gods and that they were practicing what's called henotheism, which is a belief in many, many different gods, but a worship of one or a very select few. And it could kind of explain why they drift so frequently, as those things happen. So as Christianity comes to prominence, they have to decide very early on what their views on God are going to be. And as Amanda pointed out, a lot of it grows out of Judaism that existed at the time. But a lot of it is also influenced by Greek and Roman philosophy. Like, if you study Christian philosophy from those early days, it's not that similar to Jewish philosophy. It's basically Greek philosophy with Jesus inserted into it. And there was an early saint in the church called Justin Martyr, and his explicit goal was to take Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy and Christianize it, and show all the ways that the ancient heroes and the demigods of that religion are inferior to Moses and to Abraham and to Jesus. And it was an interesting book I had to read in grad school. But anyway, they try to turn the people away from all of the Roman gods of the time. And as Amanda pointed out, you kind of portray them as being evil, as being undesirable, as demanding the flesh or the blood of human children, and you make them very evil sounding, things like this. It's like making propaganda, basically. It's exactly what it is, And as a result of this, all of these different supernatural beings and different idols and shit were either said to be non-existent or said to be some kind of demonic force that was seeking the ruin of souls. And the only way to avoid this would be to worship the true Christian God. Now, there were other competing strands at the time in addition to just early Christianity and Judaism. Another very prominent one is called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism comes in a wide variety of forms, some of which exist to this day. And it's a quest for forbidden knowledge. It's one of the reasons why I love saying the word forbidden in front of basically everything. And what Gnosticism is about is trying to find some kind of secret knowledge that exists in the universe, some kind of secret whatever. And there are a couple different traditions of this. There's a cult of a character called Mithra, who's basically like Persian Jesus, for lack of a better term. He had the gnosis, which is this secret knowledge or this path to salvation that he only gives to a very select few. And those very select few are the ones that donate the most to his church and are willing to commit the most of their resources to it, as will kind of become a recurring theme. Anyway, the other versions of Gnosticism that exist at the time swirl around. And when Jesus comes into the picture, they all kind of consolidate and it becomes more of a Christian phenomenon. And one of the major things that they teach, and something that, Amanda mentioned with the Nephilim and all that, the hybrid children of the demons and the human women and all that shit, one of the key teachings of Gnosticism, if not the key teaching of Gnosticism, is that there's a constant duality between good and evil in the world. And this wasn't new. This existed previously in a religion called Zoroastrianism, which could be a whole other thing. If you ever heard of the book Thus Spake Zarathustra, the Zarathustra was the proponent of Zoroastrianism. And that kind of said, there's a good God and there's an evil God, and they're constantly fighting, and you have to choose which one side you're on. And obviously you're supposed to choose the side of the good God, the God of light, and all this stuff. This idea of duality or dualism will evolve. And when it reaches Christian Gnostics, it will take on a new form, where now what defines something as being good or evil is whether it's spiritual or physical. And they will say that the physical world is evil. The physical world and the flesh that we inhabit is a prison for our spirit or our soul. And only one who has attained the gnosis can understand this. And the whole goal of your life is to separate your body and your soul. And you can see influence of this left over in the Bible in a couple different passages. Most notably in the Gospel of John, that opening prologue, and there's a couple of very Gnostic sounding parts in it. And then later, the letters of St. Paul, he says some of the same kind of stuff, albeit in different terms. So what they basically will say is that physical creation is an evil thing. And because they're not willing to admit that God, God the Father of Christ, as it were, could create something evil, they say that there is an evil God that created the world, the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, as it were. And this is a sinister God who's depicted as a snake, which will again become a familiar motif a little bit later on. And he creates the physical world that basically imprisons our souls and deludes us. It keeps us in this prison. It keeps us miserable, things like that. It prevents us from finding salvation. And so in that system, anything that is physical is evil, and anything that's physical is bad and is a corrupting influence. And the last part that I want to say, and then I'll let somebody else talk. How many of you have heard of Joan of Arc? Does anybody know the story of Joan of Arc? Okay. So Joan of Arc gets burned at the stake for being a witch. And there's a little bit of lore behind how they discovered that she was a witch. That's pretty entertaining. That's pretty cool. So Joan is like 14. And she's a 14-year-old girl in a society that's dominated by adult men. And she sees a vision from Christ wherein he tells her, I want you to command the French army in this war against the English so that you can finally be free of them, and so on and so forth. She's winning all these battles. She's having great success. But the nobles of her own country are suspicious of her. They're jealous. Long story short, they're jealous of her success, and they're mad that the people love her as much as they do. So they have to come up with a plan to get rid of her. And one of the classic things at the time, if you don't like someone, you accuse them of witchcraft, because this is a sure way to get them killed. So Joan's put on trial. And she is examined by a panel of bishops and high-ranking church officials. And they don't find anything in her testimony that would suggest that she is a witch or that she's consorted with the devil or any of that other kind of shit they would have accused her of. So one of her enemies urged one of his friends, who happened to be a bishop, to take a closer look at the evidence, a second opinion. It's kind of like when you go to a doctor and you don't like what they tell you, so you just go to a different doctor until they tell you what you want to hear. It's kind of the same thing that happens. And this bishop looks through Joan's diaries. He looks through her accounts of her visions of angels, and he discovers a troubling passage where, as she is there, the angel is speaking to her, and it touches her on the shoulder. And he says to his friends, these nobles and these kings in France, because this was a physical being, there is no angel that is a physical being. She's been consorting with a demon, and that's what she's describing touching her. She is a witch. And so they burn her at the stake. And that is the end of what was a very promising career. And she'd become a very well-respected and very beloved Catholic saint. So I could keep going, but that's enough for right now.